On December 4th, the Boulder Housing Committee had a meeting to discuss some of the housing concerns in Boulder. The majority of the first half of the meeting was discussing different types of discrimination, and some valuable legal information was provided. In the meeting on discrimination, much of the conversation revolved around peoples with disability, color, race, sex, felons, and undocumented persons. But some of the most impoverished people have very little protection, and with just a little insight, Boulder seems to discriminate a lot against the working poor. Some of the mechanisms of control that we investigated over this population are quite interesting. For example, homeowners can legally discriminate at the federal level if they have 3 or fewer homes, which most homeowners don't own more than 4 homes. Or if residents of a public accommodation, which are places like extended stay hotels and homeless shelters, even feel discriminated against, they only have up to 60 days to file a complaint, while people who live in housing have up to a year. These kinds of mechanisms, though maybe not intentional, definitely control an impoverished minority. However, very briefly, socioeconomic status was brought up as a possible candidate for description, though not much was said about it. And when the committee members attempted to ask questions, this was the answer they received.
See, it keeps coming back to me about being just poor in a rich area.
That's definitely a real concern, and absent the legislature expanding, that's unfortunately just the way it is.
Instead of talking about housing, we would decide to interview some of the working class members of Boulder and see what they think about housing in Boulder and what are some of the problems and concerns that they're personally facing right now.
What would have to happen in order for you to be able to consider living in Boulder?
I would either have to hit the lottery, or the city and the state in general would really have to address affordable housing. I looked into the affordable housing program in Boulder. Essentially what they told me is the wait list was about 3 years long. So I would have been more than halfway done my PhD program by the time I would have even had a chance to participate. Not only that, but a household has to make less than, I think it was $55,000 a year, which I make less than that, but even at $55,000 a year, if you're right at the top edge, it's still not affordable. You know, you're still spending the vast majority of your income on housing, which in the Evans-Greeley area, I'm spending about a third. So still too much. Colorado in general has a problem with this, but Boulder is just, you know, out of this world. None of my professors live in Boulder. They all commute from Lafayette and those areas. So it's time and money. I mean, I spend, if I come 3 days a week, I'm spending between 6 and 8 hours in the car. Okay. You know, that's a full day's work spent in the car. So I'm not as productive as I could be. And between myself and my wife, we spend about $300 a month on gas alone.
Yeah.
So that's not counting wear and tear or anything like that.
Sure. And that certainly even gets into Boulder's trying to be a clean and green city.
Right. So if all of your workers are coming from outside the town, then yeah, that kind of defeats the purpose. I look at Boulder as kind of a facade. A lot of the members of this community, especially within the government, act as if they're very progressive, left-leaning, pro-environment, pro-workers' rights, when in reality we're talking about people that all earn 6 figures a year and really either have never known what it's like to be in the working class or have lost that perspective.
If you were able to address the housing community, like say the housing committee, and tell them, you know, as somebody who is actually part of the working class and goes through these struggles and you know, you have to spend 8 hours a week in a car and all your time in Boulder and you don't even live here and you don't feel like you're part of the community, what would you tell them? What would you want to tell them about what they should do to help the people of their community?
So obviously the problem is bigger than housing alone. It's a systemic problem within what capitalism represents, which is purely profit over people. In terms of housing, if we're going to be a little less lofty, affordable housing is the most important, but a real commitment to affordable housing, and that doesn't just mean building subpar buildings and then renting them to working families. It means controlling the rent of buildings that already exist. You know, rent control
It's
used to
outlawed.
be a very common practice across the country, and I think only a few cities even consider it and have brought it back in the past 10 years or so. I don't understand the inconsistent value that we put into what landlords do for the community. Are they providing a service? Yes, they're absolutely providing a service. But the amount of time, work, and effort that goes into that service, it does not equal the gain that they get from it. And I think we really need to crack down on that.
My name is Molly Monroe. I've been living in Boulder proper for almost about 3 years.
And about how much time a week do you spend in Boulder?
100% of my time.
100%
Yeah.
of the time? And so do you live in Boulder itself?
Yep.
Have you ever not lived in Boulder?
Yes, I have.
And what were some of the outcomes from not living in Boulder and having to commute in here that you faced?
Sure. I lived in Westminster for 2.5 years, and transportation was a little harder. I didn't have my own car, so there is the bus that runs between Denver and Boulder that I could catch, but I had to figure out a way to get from my house to the park and ride to be able to get that. Versus in Boulder, there's bus stops around every single thing to get to the university.
Sure.
So transportation was a little bit of an issue for me.
That you wish the city would take up? Is there anything going on that you feel isn't being looked at as a part of the community?
Sure. I know the city does affordable housing, and I've looked into that at one point, but there's a block if you're a student. So obviously this is coming from a very personal place, and which is being a grad student. So from my personal opinion, I definitely think that's a population that's overlooked, because grad students make below they live below the poverty line for Boulder or in Boulder. And at the same time, I mean, there's so many graduate students with families or things like that. And because you're a student, you're not eligible for affordable housing. So then I feel like this is one professional population that's younger, yet also sometimes not as young. So that you have this gamut, but they're all making below the poverty line. And it's like you have to have multiple roommates, or you have to have somebody who has a lot of money, or be financially, be wealthy before coming to Boulder or grad school, because what you get paid as a TA is not enough. I would say the same thing for non-traditional students might be a population that's overlooked. So it's different to have I think many landlords have the concept in Boulder that the students' parents are providing for them, so they can charge an insane amount per room. Specifically, I think a problem is, instead of saying this house is X price, they assume that the money is not coming from one source. So for example, my partner and I, that's like, if we have combined finances, that's one source of money. And that's one thing to have a price that reflects that. Like, this house is just X. Instead, what landlords do here, they don't think of it coming from one source of money. They're like, student one has to pay this much, student two has to pay this much. They divide it by room, basically. So that ends up working out okay if you either have a full ride that includes housing or parents that are supporting you. But just because that's maybe the stereotype or a more common experience for students at the university, that doesn't mean it includes everyone. So I think, again, non-traditional students would be another population that's overlooked. I want to mention one other population that relates to this question as well, because they actually have it worse off than graduate students, which is lecturers and adjunct professors. They actually get paid less per credit hour or course than graduate students do.
Okay.
So now you have the same thing you said, like professional teachers or professors who are making even less than I do. Some of them have PhDs. So you mentioned that I don't even have a tenure track job. So it's actually not based on your qualifications, it's based on your classification, whether your classification is adjunct or your first classification is grad student versus your first classification is faculty, right? So I have friends who have their PhDs, are lecturers here and making less money than me. And the only way they can, one does not live in Boulder, they live in Longmont, and the other one, I believe, lives in Boulder, and the only way they can do so is because their partner makes a lot of money, right?
What are your opinions about not being able to afford living in a place and you have a professional job?
Sure.
You're a professor. So.
Right. Yeah, I think, you start feeling kind of helpless, like you really just don't know what to do. If I didn't have a partner that could bring in income, or my partner, let's say, was a graduate student, so we're both making below the poverty line, I literally just don't know what to do except, move outside of Boulder. Even then, though, Colorado's just getting so expensive, like Denver is too expensive, so then you're limited to maybe the suburbs, then maybe transportation becomes a problem, right? Along with the socioeconomic status, we're assuming that people also can afford cars and for transportation, right, as well. So I think I have feelings of sort of like helplessness. Like, I don't know how to rectify the situation. And like I said, with being a student, I'm already kicked out of affordable housing if I wanted to buy. I mean, it's very strange. And this is my 10th year here, and I would like to even stay in Boulder. And I don't really see how that's possible. I feel part of the university community, maybe not the Boulder community. I feel part of CU community just because I come here and spend all my time at the university, etc. As far as like a more Boulder community, I don't feel part of that community yet because I feel like I'm specifically placed in this classification of a grad student, so I don't have enough money to really be kind of like a real professional or live a certain place or even do certain activities that maybe someone who was living at a certain affordable, they had enough money to live comfortably, right? Then you can be part of the community in the sense that you can pay for events, you can go to shows, you can go to bars, you can go to restaurants and things like that, right? So the money trickles in, even just without housing, it trickles into maybe literally being out with people and feeling part of the community in that way.
And also, you don't have to give an exact number, but
Sure.
roughly how many people do you know that are in your situation right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the first part about, speaking to the board or if you wanted them to know something, I think that there needs to be a revisiting of the affordable housing program because I actually, even though it is more affordable than houses that are not in the affordable housing program, they are still not affordable for most people, right? So I don't really consider them like super affordable housing. I consider them like medium income affordable housing, right? And I guess just like the beginning of our conversation, finding a way, even if this is like a task force or a certain subcommittee, to consider some of these other student populations, right? Whether that's the grad student population. What about these lecturers that I'm talking about to you that make less than grad students do?
Or all the faculty workers
or
trash workers and stuff.
Yeah, so hourly, lower hourly salaried people. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of people that are like really in the community and in the university community that then fall outside of the bigger Boulder community because